Hi folks, in this video series we're going to take this unused wall and we're going to turn it into this. Welcome to part 2 of my 3-part video series of taking unused wall space and turning it into this, my ideal clamp storage solution. In part 1 we went out and we found some old pallets, we brought them back, we milled them up, turned them into shiplap and installed them on this wall. And today we're going to take some plywood and we're going to create a French cleat system on this wall. And that will give us the flexibility to make holders so that we can move them around where we want to make the most out of the available space. Let's get started. I've got my sheet of plywood that I'm going to use for this. It is 3/4 inch sandy ply, not the best plywood in the world, but most of it looks like it doesn't have a lot of voids in it. I think it will work fine for this application. It's just hard to find birch around here, and it's incredibly expensive. This is expensive too, but just not quite as bad. So that's what I'll use for the cleats. I'm going to do 3 inches for the cleat. Do not have to go that large. I could definitely do 2.5, maybe even 2 inches in a lot of cases. I probably wouldn't go below 2 inches just because I want to have room to have 2 screws, one above the other, on these cleats. It is going to be holding a lot of weight. This is going to be the wall that holds all my clamps and whatever else I can fit on there. But with the clamps, I'm going to build the holders so that they come out away from the wall. And they're going to have at least 4 large style clamps on there. Maybe more. We'll see how that looks and if we can get those strong enough to where we think they look okay to hold the clamps. But with all that weight on there, I'm just going to go with the 3 inch, and I think visually it'll look good. So I pulled out the track saw so that I could rip this plywood down into a more manageable piece. I could have cut all the strips with the track saw, but I really wanted to do this on the table saw. So I just wanted a chunk that I could get over there and handle on the table saw. Once I got to the table saw, I set up for a 6-inch rip. And then I ran the plywood through, getting all of my strips. Now I'll get 2 cleats out of each 6-inch piece because we have to rip those down the middle. While I was set up for this, I went ahead and ripped my 5-inch cleats, and these are going to be used for the tool holders themselves. I don't need them yet, but I'm already set up, so I might as well do it now. And now I'm ready to move on to cut my 45-degree angles in my cleats. But first, I need to change that throat plate. I have a 0 clearance insert in there, and because I'm going to be cutting at an angle, I need something with a wider throat. So I'm just reinstalling the one that came from the factory for this purpose. And then I'm going to use my electronic angle finder, and this thing is really nice in the shop. If you don't have one, they're really cheap. I recommend you getting one. But basically, I set it on my flat reference surface, the table saw in this case, and I zero it out. Once I have it zeroed out, I can use it to put it on the blade and then find the exact angle. And of course, I'm unplugged doing this, so make sure you do too. Don't have power when you're messing with blades like this. But I dial that in and get it to the perfect 45-degree angle, and I'm ready to go. Now I need to find the center of the board. So I'm just measuring that and marking it, making sure I have the right spot. And once I have the center marked, as far as the width of the board, then I need to work on finding the center on the thickness of the board. Now this is a 5-ply plywood, so it's pretty easy to look down in there and see where the middle ply is. And I just want to make sure this 45 transects that center mark on the board. So I'm just doing a little test cut here with the fence set approximately where I think I need it. And then what I will do is go ahead and use a tape measure and verify that I'm getting 2 even cuts. And I didn't the first time. I went ahead and did 2 or 3 adjustments, I believe, until I got it exactly where I wanted it. Now you could have done some math with this to get the fence exactly where you wanted it, but this process seemed fairly simple to me, so I just went about it this way. And it worked fine. And of course, once they're dialed in and you've got everything exactly where you need it, then it's a matter of just running through the batches and getting them all done. And then after I did this, I came back and I did the process again for the cleats that will go on the clamp holders in the end. Again, I did not need them at this stage, but I figured I'd go ahead and do them while I was here anyway. I'm going to go ahead and finish the setup and ripping these down in the background. I would like to talk to you about subscriptions and liking. I really hope that you like the content that I'm producing. Perhaps you've already seen some of my other videos. I am a new content creator, so I'm still working my way through this process. But if you do like the content and would like me to keep producing more, anything you would do to like, subscribe, and even participate in the comments is greatly appreciated. The comments are really useful for me too, because I like learning from y'all. And that's what I say this channel's about. Let's go ahead and learn together in this journey. So anything you would do to like, subscribe, and participate in the comments is greatly appreciated. We'll finish this up and then we'll move on to the next step. Thanks. Now that I'm done with the 45-degree angle, I needed to reset the table saw back to 90 degrees. So I went through and replaced the throat plate with the zero clearance throat plate so it would be ready. And then I used the little digital angle finder again and basically just went through and zeroed it out and then used it to make sure I got my blade at 90 degrees. And as always, make sure your table saw is unplugged when you're doing this operation. And then I'm doing a very important step, and that's I'm taking about a blade width off the edge of the French cleat. And that is because those things at a 45-degree angle are incredibly sharp. It would be easy to slide your hand across them and cut yourself. So this will take care of that. It also gives a little bit of a reservoir area for dust to settle in your French cleat to where it won't affect operations. And now it's time for a bit of sanding. So I pulled out my trusty sander and dust collection and got to work. So once I get a rhythm going, it's not so bad. Basically, I'm just sanding the back lightly, the inside edge, the bottom, and then on the side that's going to show, I'm going over it, sanding a little bit better, and then hitting those corners on all sides. I'm just lightly taking the edge off. Of course, I'm not going to bore you with a whole lot of sanding here. I just want to let you know I did go through the process, and this is what a sanded stack looks like. I had already decided that I wasn't going to start below the electrical socket. I'm actually going to come up a little bit above it. There's no need to put a cleat down there because realistically, I'm not going to hang anything down there that I'm going to reach down and get off there. Plus, it'll give me a little bit of space in case I put something that has a base to it down in this area so that it doesn't just block the cleat. So I'm going to go ahead and mark for my first cleat. Then I'm going to take the cleat, apply some glue, get it level, and then I'm going to brad nail it in place. Then I'm going to come back and do each of the cleats. Now the cleats are a bit long right now because I cut them off a 4-foot wide sheet of plywood. So I'm going to have to cut them to fit. I take a quick measurement of what that first cleat needs to be, then transfer that over onto the cleat and use the chop saw to go ahead and cut that down to size. Now this gives me a little bit of excess, but this is not going to go to waste. I will keep it for some smaller pieces. And then I may also use this as the cleat on the other side, although I may trim it down a little bit so it's not quite as tall. But we'll make use of this at some point. Now, one of the key things to remember as you go along here, and it seems obvious, but if you're like me, you get going and sometimes your brain turns off, is to make sure it's put in the correct direction. And that would be making sure the cleat piece is up and that the small part is toward the wall so that the cleat faces out like this, so that it hooks behind there. I know that seems obvious, but I could see me get going and just forget that. I'm not putting a ton of glue. I also want to be careful about squeeze out. I do not want to have squeeze out come up into the cleat area, if at all possible. And we will get the board level. And of course, getting that board level was very, very important because that's the first board and we're going to work everything else off that. So we should be good now.
For this next step, I pulled out my big old heavy table saw sled. It's a tank, but I would not want to work in the shop without this thing. It is incredibly useful. I also feel it's safer than using a typical miter saw, especially when you're working with small pieces. And of course, having a series of stop blocks and hold down clamps on your table saw sled make it even more versatile. I used the 5-cut method to make sure it was really dialed in. There's plenty of videos out there on that if you want to go look for that. I just customized the design to something I thought that would work for me. Now what I'm doing is I'm creating a 3-inch block that I'll use for the spacing of my cleats. I also went ahead and cut a pair of 4-inch blocks here just in case I wanted to use those at some point. And I would have them in the future. So after I create them, I label them and I'll store them in a safe place. Hopefully I'll be able to find them later and I can reuse these things.
I had gone back and forth between a 3 and a 4-inch gap in between these. I did it on a story stick to see what I thought I would like. Still wasn't 100% sure. So I'm going to put these on here and just take a look at 2 different heights and see which one I like better. That's the 4-inch gap. That looks pretty good. And there's the 3-inch gap. I'm going to say visually, they're both good. I don't have a problem with either one. Functionally, I'll say that the 3-inch would perhaps give me a little bit more room to work with as far as cleat storage when I work my way up. It won't be a whole lot. We're looking at an inch per cleat basically, but I could get a couple extra cleats possibly in there. Now, a lot of what I'm going to store on here are clamps of various sizes, some of which are fairly long. So with the long clamps, I'm really going to lose a lot of space in here anyway. So for that reason, 4-inch could also work. But I think I like the idea of the 3-inch better. Perhaps my clamps will move somewhere else in the future. And by going 3-inch, I have more versatility for other things. So I'm going to go with 3-inch. So at this point, it's pretty much just repeat the process and keep going all the way up. I will have to work around a few items here. I'll do that, but I'm just going to keep working myself up and do the same process over and over again. So that went up fairly quickly. I do have a few tips. Don't do like I did on a few of these. You have to remember there is the 45-degree angle here. And so when I got carried away nailing, and this should be obvious, but I will say it, don't nail too high up because you'll be going through the 45 and that could impede your French cleat. Obviously we don't want that. I had a couple where I came really close. The nail is exposed a little bit. Because of the little piece that I cut off here, I think it's fine. But my plan is to, after these have dried thoroughly, I'm going to take my really small cold chisel and I'll just tap those down in to make sure they're down inside the wood here and out of the way. I'm also going to follow these up with screws. These are going to get sets of screws, 2 for each stud that we cross here to make sure this is really up there good. And I'll do that after the glue dries. Keep in mind that these are going to store clamps, and I have a lot of clamps. Obviously never enough clamps, but a lot. And that's going to be a tremendous amount of weight. So I'm going to add the screws just to make sure these are really good and secure up here. But I'm really happy with how it turned out so far. It's looking good. Well, I finished sanding this wall. That's after I had put the brad nails in and then filled them. I used some natural plastic wood filler. to do that. They look okay. The lighter pieces of plywood, you can not even tell where it's been filled. The darker pieces stand out a bit. I have not decided how I'm going to finish this wall off yet, but that's going to come a little bit later. I'm going to have this wall fully functional before I come back and finish it, because I want to extend it on up and I want to make sure that's all done before I put a finish on it. But I haven't decided what I want to use yet. And if you have any ideas, I'm open to comments. I'd like some ideas. I thought about Danish oil. I thought about using a gel stain. And then I thought about just putting some type of shellac on it. I haven't decided yet. I do have the wood filler that's going to show. I also have screws that I have to put in here, and those will show. I'm not going to recess them and cap them off with anything, so the screw heads will show. But if you have any ideas, put them in the comments. Now I'm going to go work on getting this thing screwed up into the wall so it's really secure for those heavy clamps. So this is my first ever French cleat accessory, and it just so happens that it's a jig. Let's see how it fits. That's nice. Now, obviously, this is a very narrow cleat, so it would have a tendency to rock back and forth, but just sitting it in there, it feels nice and tight, doesn't want to come forward, and by giving it just a little push, it's nice and snug. Obviously, you would have the traditional issue of lifting up if you had something light on here and you decided to pull something up and caught it, it may come with you. And in those cases, you might need to come up with a locking mechanism, and we'll deal with that as we go. So right now, what I have to do is decide where I want the holes on this jig. And I think visually, I'm going to like 7/8 from the top and 7/8 from the bottom. So that's where I'm going to mark this jig at. Now that makes sure I get past the angle of the cleat, because obviously we don't want the screw going through the open area behind there on the cleat. But I'm liking 7/8, so we're going to go with that. And that way it'll have some symmetry, but also a lot of holding power. Now I need to transcribe that mark onto this. Now I'll carry this around and I'll mark it for this size cleat, and I'll pre-drill the holes so that I can get in with my pencil and make the mark where the screws need to go. And then I'm going to put notches in line with those lines on the right side and on the left side at both locations. And that is to facilitate if you get up close to an object, or let's say the edge of the wall, and you're trying to hit the edge of a 2x4 or stud, you want to be able to get in there and mark it of where your cleat would go. And it's not right in the middle of this, then you'll be able to make the mark on the side. And then this will be a multi-purpose jig I can use for years to come. I'm also going to keep this, and then as I have different size cleats, I will mark them according to their size and put additional holes in here, and then I'll be able to use it for other purposes. At some point in the future, I'm going to build a tabletop for this drill press. Right now it's configured mostly for metalworking, and you can see a lot of different drill press tops on YouTube and different ways to make them. But we'll design something and figure out what works for my shop. But for right now, what I've done is I don't have a nice wood clamp to hold this down, and I don't have any clamping methods to hold this down. So I put this piece of wood on here, and I use 2 clamps off to the side to help hold this. So we're going to go ahead and drill this hole. I did put a scrap piece below it so that we can give it some support. I'm not really worried that much about blowout, but it'll help with the blowout also. But hopefully keep me in place so I can get a nice centered hole. Once I finished the first hole, I flipped the piece around so I could put the second hole in there for that second screw. And then just went ahead and drilled that out. Once that was done, I took it over to the bandsaw and just notched out the sides. And I did this for both sides. This will allow me to make those edge marks if I ever need to. Before I put the wall boards up, I took the time to mark on the floor where the studs were. And then, of course, I can find the studs up top because they're still exposed. So I'm going to run a chalk line down here so that I can know where the studs are.
I went ahead and snapped that chalk line so I could make my marks. And I will say, lesson learned here, I should not have used red chalk. That was a really poor decision. I should have used white chalk, or next time I think I'll use the laser level to make these lines so that I don't have to worry about it leaving the residue and staining the wood and doing a lot of extra sanding, which is what I ended up doing here. Now what I'm doing is I'm taking my jig and I'm going to go to every point where it crosses a stud there, and I'm going to make a mark. I actually ended up using this punch tool, which did a good job, just to leave a little indent. And then I could use that to come back and drill for where I'm going to put my screws. Next, I came back and hit every one of those with my countersink drill bit. And that thing is very nice. If you don't have one, it's good with recessing screws.
That really made quick work of that. That was nice. I'm going to do a bit of a cleanup work here. I'm going to get some of this red chalk off. Hopefully it doesn't stain the wood too bad, but I can sand it down a bit if I have to.
As I might have already mentioned, it did stain the wood, and it took quite a bit of sanding to get it back to where it needed to be.
Well, we're finally down to the last stage of getting these mounted. We're going to put the screws in. Then we can start making holders and putting things on here. Of course, we'll come back later and put some kind of finish on here like we discussed earlier.
You've probably never seen somebody screw a project up this fast before. Wait, that doesn't sound. You've probably never seen somebody apply screws this fast before. But we're going through and hitting each one of these and getting the screws on each one of the pre-drill holes.
That's it.
Now that we have the French cleats in place, we can start working on the holders, and that'll be next.
Hi folks, I hope you enjoyed part 2 of my 3-part video series. Part 1 will be linked over here, and part 3 will be linked here once I post that. But if you want to get ahead of the game, go ahead and subscribe and hit that alert button so that you'll get notified as soon as the next part comes out. Thanks for watching.